So welcome to Belfast Rail. Today's guest is Lisa Samet. Lisa graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. She spent 10 years in marketing with Procter& Gamble. Lisa realized her real love was naturopathic healing, and in 1998 she received her doctorate in naturopathic medicine from the Southwest College of Naturopathic Medicine. She runs her own practice in Montreal, and Lisa has also appeared on the Dr. Oz show. She's also a lecturer on various topics, including emotional repatterning, homeopathy, menopause, and the aging brain. And her new book, Emotional Repatterning, is out on April 1st, and I'm assuming it's available for pre-order as well. Yeah.
Yes.
So Lisa, thank you very much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Just to get started, Lisa, basically, in the past 20 years, you've been, this ties in with the book, the past 20 years you've been treating different people, various patients with different ailments and conditions, and you noticed that one was a kind of a common thread amongst them, which is like emotional stress or wrong thinking. How big, what did you observe, and what do you mean by the term wrong thinking?
Yeah, so it's not in every case for sure, but it seems to me that often when there's a chronic disease, that there can be a history of stress, disappointment, loss, anger at injustice, or some such event that happens in people's lives. And because most of us are not very good at dealing with emotions and dealing with stress and reactions to stress, people internalize all the difficulties there, and often as not, that can lead to illness. And I don't know that in this day and age that's any shock to anyone anymore. Maybe 20 years ago, this idea became more popular about the mind-body connection. But it's one thing to read about it, and it's another thing to actually see it. So I've had the opportunity over the past more than 20 years to treat people in my office in an intimate doctor-patient relationship type of setting. And so when you probe into the person's illness and disease and symptoms, as we do in naturopathic and homeopathic medicine, you come to find out that often there is an event that was very upsetting or stressful that preceded the onset of certain symptoms, whether it be cancer or an autoimmune disease or migraines or whatever you want to call it. And so, of course, as a naturopath, I approach people in a holistic manner, meaning that, we don't treat a throat, we don't treat a joint, we don't treat, a head, we treat a person. And so, of course, in an interview in that case, we're looking at the whole person. So that's physically, mentally, and emotionally what's going on. And when I realized how much people are suffering, including myself in various stages in my life, I don't feel that I'm apart from that. You realize that how we process emotions or not, as the case may be, can certainly depress or upset the immune system, and then certain physical ailments take place. So in wanting to address the whole person, I had a growing interest in how can we deal with this stress, this dis-ease on the emotional level that seems to be related to being ill on the physical level. So that's kind of what opened the whole subject up for me.
Yeah, because if anyone's familiar with watching the show, I interviewed a guy called Tony Summers, and he's a trained counsellor, and he's worked with people with drug addictions and even professional boxers. And he was saying there was a guy called, I think the name was Troy James, and he was a professional or amateur boxer in England. And coming up to fights, he'd have obviously a lot of fear and a lot of stress. It would normally manifest itself in almost like a, if I remember correctly, it was almost like a chest infection. He felt ill, and it was just purely because of the thinking about what was going to come, what was going to happen. And then once they kind of Tony readdressed that disappeared, and that never happened. With what do you call it? With our relationship our relationship with ourselves, obviously it affects our health. what are ways can it manifest itself? Like illness, like maybe like pains or muscular pains or headaches.
Anything. I mean, I think, there are some people that see a one-to-one relationship between a stressful day and a headache at night. So that's maybe in the most simple form. That's the feedback you can get right away. I think in a bigger form, there are major diseases, cancer, autoimmune diseases, as I mentioned. I mean, pretty much any chronic disease could be related to ongoing stress, which I mean, who escapes that in life, right? I mean, nobody sails through this journey. No. There's always going to be stress, so we can't really do much about that, right? But what we can do is see and notice our reaction to that and understand better why we have such a degree of reaction to what's going on in life that would cause us to be chronically sick. Right? So it's not about what happens, it's about how we react to it. And that's the place that we actually have some leverage, because we can't control very much of what comes our way. Maybe we can control some of it, but life is going to present us with, I call them gifts, a little bit ironically. Life is going to present us with gifts. That's not a coincidence. That's how it's supposed to be, right? Because in my philosophy of things, we have come here to learn and grow. And most people do that through suffering, unfortunately. There's very few of us that decide when things are going great, hey, let me look within and see all the things that aren't working and try to grow and evolve, without that external prompt. Most of us don't do it that way. So we get little help from the universe in the form of challenges, and we have the opportunity to step into that and figure out how we can evolve and learn something in the face of being challenged, and then upgrade our, I call it software. And as we do that, we become more wise. And so when we get gifted by the universe, we have many opportunities there to decide how we're going to show up for that. There's obviously denial, which a lot of people use. Just look the other way and hopefully it's going to go away soon. Then there's just kind of treading water through it, which isn't maybe the most skillful way. And then there's the head-on plunge, if you will, which is to really show up for what's going on and ask ourselves, why is this in my life and what's in it for me? How do I need to show up better to get through this difficult time so that I can learn something? In other words, take the opportunity to wring every last drop of understanding out of the situation about me and my role in the situation. And if I can do that, well, then it's not for nothing. It's like, well, yeah, that was hard. I suffered a lot, but gee, I learned something there. And that learning is so important for me to live the rest of my life better. So it's an approach, it's a way of looking at things that, I think unless you have the understanding that it's possible to do so, most people default to negativity and to a level of stress that can certainly lead to illness.
Yeah, because I think, and again, from speaking for myself, there's times where you go through things and just it's just horrendous, and you're just like, it's not until years later you look back and you go, oh, it's kind of like reframing it, and you kind of realize, actually, that cause that happened, that's actually led me down a better path. Yes, it was horrible to go through, or certain things happen, that again with hindsight you go, I'm so glad that took place. Do you find when people are coming in, do you find people's awareness is greater of this now, or are they unaware, and then when you point it out or highlight it as part of their treatment, do you find it's almost like a revelation to them in a way?
Well, it's a great question. Despite the degree that all of this has been already talked about, right? The relationship between stress and illness and mind, body, and all that, I find people are, for the most part, unaware of the fact that they can look deeply within themselves, find a reframe or a different way to perceive the same set of circumstances and go through an event better. You know, it's a great question you're asking, because one of the most shocking things I think I've heard over time, and now it doesn't shock me much at all, is people who have gone through cancer and survived it. And you and I both know people who have done this, right? It's not fun. It's not easy. It's scary. It's difficult. It's painful. The drugs, the uncertainty, the feeling sick, all of it, all of it. You would think, who in their right mind could ever say, wow, you know, it was tough, but I wouldn't trade that for the world. Or in a certain way, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. You know, that's shocking if somebody would report that. And yet I've heard that from so many people, that having lived through that, in order to go through that, they've had to really dig deep. They've had to really find something inside themselves that they didn't know they had, whether it's just the strength to get through it or a way to look at life differently, that after they recovered, stayed with them and they became wiser for the experience, and it's helped them look at life and the remainder of their life in such a different way that they feel it was a gift. And so when you can hear that from somebody who's been through hell and back, it's very striking.
Yeah, because it reminds me of, there's a lady I met a few years ago, and she had breast cancer. When she got the diagnosis, they pretty much said, you're not going to live long. And she said she was in this kind of haze. Her brain was trying to process what she'd just been told. And they kind of ushered her into this room. I think it was like counsellors there, and this was in the hospital. Her husband was there, and they started talking about preparing for your funeral and how to speak to your loved ones. And she said she just felt like everything was like closing in, and she just, instead of kind of like breaking down, she had this rage, and she just literally says, this isn't happening. And they're like, no, this is denial. And no, she's like, no, I'm not going to die. I'm going to, and she fought through it. And they tried to get her husband to say, look, you need to help her, get her back in. We'll chat with her about this. And she just went, no, I'm not taking any of your calls. What's the treatment? And let's do that. And she made a full recovery, and is fit and healthy, and yeah, it's going to live a long life. But it's interesting how powerful, as you said, the mind is, about people having to dig deep, and I think sometimes it's not until you're properly tested you realize. I think a lot of people surprise themselves about what's within them.
Right. And, you know, I think it speaks a bit to the arrogance of the conventional medical system, that they feel they have the right to inform somebody when they're going to die, because, I mean, miracles happen all the time. And the unfortunate part of that, and it actually speaks directly to my book, which is Emotional Repatterning, about how much deep beliefs affect the experience of our lives. So in the situation that you described, where the medical people, these authority figures who apparently know everything, pronounce to you, well, gee, you know, you've got a few weeks, you should get your affairs in order. If somebody were to buy into that or believe that, then there's more than one example in the literature of how people actually create that very thing. Yeah. So belief has an enormous impact on how we live our lives. And that's a great example of how a negative belief will create a certain outcome. Because there's been stories in the literature of doctors who make a mistake and they say, oh, you have this cancer and, you know, you have 6 weeks. And then the person actually dies after 6 weeks, and they do an autopsy, and in fact, they didn't have that cancer. It was a mistaken diagnosis, that the person wasn't even terminally ill. It just shows you the power of belief. And so when we understand that, it actually works in the opposite way too. If we believe, for example, that our body has everything it needs to heal ourselves, and that we are destined to live a much longer life than having it end now, well, of course, that belief changes everything as well, and changes your immune function, and changes potentially your longevity and your ability to fight a disease. So, you know, my book is about changing your subconscious beliefs, your very deep beliefs, not just the chit chat in our conscious mind, which is, ongoing nonsense for the most part, but it's your really deep and subconscious beliefs. Because when we can work at that level and change those beliefs, well, we change the outcomes, whether we're talking about terminal illness or whether we're talking about our ability to get a certain job that we're interviewing for. What we believe deep down is essentially what we create in our lives. And when we really get that, wow, that's a big sense of empowerment that comes with it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And if you don't mind, another thing I remember reading about, which ties in with what we're talking about, it was a book by Viktor Frankl.
Yes.
Meaning.
Search for meaning, yeah.
For anyone who doesn't know who he is, he was a psychologist who was put into Auschwitz, and he wrote this book after he was released. It's a fantastic book. But he was saying about certain prisoners, the rumors would kind of go around the camp that they were going to be liberated, the Russians were coming, and some prisoners would go, we're going to be released in 10 days' time. This is all over. And he would say once the 10 days came, and it dawned on him that there was no escape, there was no liberation. He says literally those people would be dead within 24 hours. They would just give up and die, or just it's almost like they were just lying in their bed, and even if the SS guards came in, were beating them, just nothing would shake them out. It was just, it's over, and they would just pass away. So it's a very, I think it's a very powerful account of how powerful our mind is. It could be, we can use it to aid us, or we can use it as a weapon against ourselves and inflict great pain and suffering. Going to your book, what is, you mentioned it was the title of the book is Emotional Repatterning. What is that? If you could explain that.
Yeah. So, well, I say that there's actually two parts of it. One is identifying the subconscious beliefs that we have. So it's hard to do that in a sense because it's subconscious, right? So I can't ask you, oh, Jonathan, what are your subconscious beliefs? Because if you knew them, they wouldn't be subconscious, they would be conscious, right? So we have maybe some sense of what goes on in our subconscious mind, certain repetitive beliefs, certain patterns of thinking. It's not that we're unfamiliar totally with that, but we may not know all that's in there. So one part of this process is to understand what is in our subconscious that's affecting how we view the world. I like to think of it as kind of wearing a pair of glasses and the prescription that's in them, right? So the more negative or unself-serving those subconscious beliefs are, the worse the prescription in our glasses, and then the more distorted reality is. Right? So one sense of that is to understand what those subconscious beliefs are and how wrong thinking or different ways of seeing things affect our beliefs. The second piece of that is changing them, right? Because we don't want to live with a negative pattern of thinking or a disempowering way of thinking, because then it's hard to change that. So that perpetuates the ongoing negativity or lack of power, right? Because, in the case that we were just talking to, Viktor Frankl, or a doctor pronouncing you have a certain amount of time to live, if we buy into the negative way of seeing the thing, it's very disempowering. Then we're the victim of the outer circumstances. Right? And once we're in a victim role of outer beliefs or outer circumstances, we're disempowered. And so we've given up our ability to change things in our lives for the better. When we take responsibility for what's ours, then it's very empowering. So I'm all about, let's take responsibility as much as possible for whatever's going on, which is frankly the exact opposite of the way most of us do things, right? It's their fault, and they said, and they told us, and all these other things that other people did, which then leaves us in a smaller negative victim role, rather than saying, okay, here's my piece in the thing. here's what I have to manage. And the more we can take on of that, the more power we have, the more responsibility we have, the more we can affect things, the more we can affect how we show up, the more we can affect the end result. So I think when we talk about emotional repatterning, it's about understanding our deep self, taking responsibility for what's ours, and then changing what we can. And then, you know, when we can do that, the whole thing shifts, because suddenly things look different, and the prescription and the glasses get really much, much more accurate. And so what we see is closer to reality rather than our own distortions of reality, which is the stories we like to tell ourselves about things.
Yeah, because what I'm thinking, or so that can all come from, obviously it can come from ourselves, but when I was preparing for this interview, there's a couple of dots connected in my head. I suppose one thing you can also be implanted onto a person from a group. So maybe you're part of a group. I need to be careful because there's a couple of examples I have in my head. You could be in a group, and that group could be, yes, from the outside, a group of trying to empower people, but the as you said, their lens that they look through at things is obscured or wrong, and that creates then what they maybe think over empowering or people who are part of this group, but actually what they're doing is they're disempowering them. Would that be right in saying that? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know what?
Apologies, there, a bit of a technical fault. So we're back. So we were talking about basically empowerment. We were talking about how our mindset can disempower us, and I think I mentioned about groups that can give us wrong thinking as well, and we might feel empowered, especially what's all going on at the moment. But actually, it disempowers you, and is that? So we were talking about that, weren't we?
Yeah. So, you know, we all have these repository of beliefs we could call it the back of our mind. I call it subconscious, but whatever it is, it's not necessarily the conscious way we think about things, right? Because often in our conscious mind, we're determined to be positive and say affirmations and exercise every day and eat right. And we have all these ideas in our mind about what we want, or in the conscious mind. And we all know that often those things don't ever come to fruition, because underneath your conscious mind is your subconscious mind. And there's a lot of beliefs there that influence our perceptions and our perspectives on things. And so unless we kind of deal with that, we often find ourselves frustrated because we don't follow through on things that we want or things that we have set as goals. And so why is that? What is it that trips us up each time? And it's often this kind of belief, or a series of beliefs, or negative patterns, or negative thinking, or however you want to talk about it, that gets in our way. So when we understand that, and then we determine to try to mine the depths of that, and understand some of the, what I call wrong thinking or thinking traps that exist there, and when we can deal with it at that level, we often can change enormously how we can show up for our own lives, right? In terms of changing our perceptions, in terms of understanding life in a different way, because most of us were taught to be reactive and take things very personally, and the way we approach life causes us a lot of pain and suffering. And if we could change how we approach life, we could go through it a lot more gracefully with a lot less suffering. And isn't that what we all want? So in my book, Emotional Repatterning, I talk about the steps to get there. First of all, understanding what's going on. And second of all, learning how to change those deep and subconscious beliefs so we can show up with a different outlook, with a different way to approach life, which is going to yield so much more happiness and lightness.
Yeah. In the book, and I think you just mentioned there, what is the 8 thinking traps?
Right. So I have kind of deciphered, if you will, that there seem to be 8 of them, and there are 8 of them that I'm going to label. Are there more? Are there less? Maybe. But how did I come to these 8? Because for years and years now, I've been working with patients in my office on this level of trying to discover what it is about how we see the world that causes us so much suffering, right? Because it's really a matter of perception. Because, we've known people who have gone through really difficult things, and because of the way they seem to understand it, they go through much more gracefully than maybe other people who are confronted with the same circumstances, who get stuck in that for years and years and years, and do all kinds of behaviors, have all kinds of addictions, have different ways of coping with it that just perpetuate the suffering. What's the difference between those people? I think it's the way that we translate, that we perceive what happens in life. And so after years of working with patients, I realized that although everybody's problems on the surface look very different, right, because they're each a different story, when you boil them down, they're actually the same. We're all living the same suffering, although the details might be different. And so it came to me that a lot of the stories and a lot of the events and a lot of the difficulties we go through and the way we process those things can be boiled down to 8 ways of wrong thinking or thinking traps. So I'll just list them for you. They're each a chapter in my book, Emotional Repatterning. Maybe you'll resonate with some of these more than others, but I think it's fair to say that the 8 of them are self-love, acceptance, particularly acceptance of life and what's happening, right? Rather than fighting with that, which is what most of us do. Most of us don't want to accept things as they are, people as they are, events as they are. Most of us want to change things in the outside world, which is a near impossibility. We can only change ourselves. So, it's that level of dissonance with what's going on or who people are or how things show up that is a non-acceptance, which causes an enormous amount of suffering. Another thinking trap is responsibility, that we often don't want to take responsibility for what's ours in any given situation. We like to blame or, say if that person said and that person makes me feel and that person did. And that's really abdicating responsibility. And when you abdicate responsibility, you lose your power. Because if it's your fault, well, then I'm never going to be happier because I can't change you. That's for sure. We've all tried. We've all come up empty-handed. We can't change the other. We can only change us. So if I don't take responsibility for my part in it, whether it's a big part or a small part, I'm stuck. I'm stuck and I'll suffer. Right? So I want to take as much responsibility for what's mine as I can because that empowers me to make changes. So it's not a matter of blaming me. It's a matter of taking responsibility for what's mine in a completely selfish way. Because when I'm responsible for some of it, I can change that piece. And once I can change something, I'm no longer stuck. The other thinking trap is stories. So that means, what are the stories I tell myself about what's happened to me in my life? And when you start to delve into this with people, you realize why we're all suffering, because the stories are not conducive to my good health usually, right? It's stories and interpretations of events that either show my lack of self-love, my lack of self-worth, my lack of self-empowerment, or it's very much a blaming story, or they did and they said, and now I'm stuck, right? So when you get into the stories that we tell ourselves in our subconscious mind, you realize that it's a minefield, and that if we could change our story about what happened, if we could change our perception, our interpretation of what happened, wow, we could feel a lot better. But often we get stuck in a way of seeing things. It's your Viktor Frankl analogy. He had a way of telling himself a story about what was going on that enabled him to continue to be optimistic and to push through even in the hard moments and to survive. Whereas other people in the exact same situation told themselves a different story. we're doomed. How could they be doing this? This isn't fair. We're never going to survive this. That story led to bad results in many cases. So we have so much power to tell ourselves a better story about the facts that are presented. The better story is just as valid and just as true as the bad story, because in fact, there's no truth when we're telling ourselves a story. So why not pick a better one?
Yeah.
The fifth thinking trap is what I call co-creation. So we all, or many of us at times when we're suffering, fail to realize that we're not in this alone, right? We are in this with a higher power. That's at least my view of things. So it's a co-creation. Our lives are a co-creation. So we have help, in other words. It's not just me struggling through and plodding through and trying to find a better way, that there is help there, that there is a co-creation, that I'm in this for a reason, that it's not just bad luck or something bad happened to me that I don't deserve, right? So that if I reach out and I try to connect better with my own intuition, with my higher self, with a higher power, I don't feel so alone in the difficulty. I can have some trust that things are going to go forward and things are going to be better if I can tap into that.
Yeah.
Another thinking trap that I talk about in the book is that, and it's called gifts, that so many of these challenges in our lives are actually gifts. We see it as bad luck. We see it as, oh, I didn't deserve this, and how come this crappy thing happened? But like we talked about earlier, that when patients often survive cancer, they look back and they say, I would have never thought this at the time, but that was the best thing that ever happened to me, as hard as it was, because I learned so much. I'm a different person having emerged from that. So then we can say, well, in a way, that was a gift, right? And how much better it could be if in the moment, not just in hindsight, we could say, wow, this difficulty must be a gift somehow. What's in this for me? How can I go through this better? How can I understand the learning that I'm supposed to have from this and try to incorporate that now in real time, not just in hindsight? And if in doing so, would it make this moment easier? Would it make this moment somehow feel of some kind of value and not just bad luck?
Yeah.
Another thinking trap is regret. And, you know, most of us tend to do that. We look back and we say, oh, you know, if only I had done the other thing, if only I had taken the other job, if only I had married the other person, if only I had, you know, tried harder to have that child when it was difficult. If only, you know, we look back and we have such pain and angst about things we didn't do. And I always find that funny. I try to keep myself very, very honest with this regret piece, because what we do, and it's actually quite funny, is we see the road not taken as having worked out in the best possible way. You know, who says that ever would have happened that way? What happens that way? Right? I mean, what if the thing that we didn't do would have turned out to be horrible? Then the truth of the matter is what we picked may be for sure the better way. So regret is like a BS story we tell ourselves that it would have been better had we done it a different way. And where's the fact of that? I mean, that not.
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe you're going to have comments on these, but just to finish, you know, the eighth thinking trap is really about the horror of death, right? What we tell ourselves to be the difficulty and the avoid at all costs approach to death. And I think that whole misunderstanding about death causes many people to be incredibly anxious here on planet Earth, whether it's anxiety about health or avoiding death at all costs. Because death is something to be avoided at all costs, the way our society looks at death, instead of a journey home, which is how I see it. And if we could really understand that Earth is a school and it's where we come to learn and evolve as a soul, and it has a back end date, for sure it has a back end date. We are leaving here. And that's a fact. And the journey back and the return will be fantastic, like any homecoming. It takes away this avoidance and fear of death, which I think underlies so many of the ways that we approach our lives.
Yeah.
So I've given you a long answer to your question. I mean, feel free to answer and ask me more about any one of those pieces.
No, I think they're really good. I think it puts it nicely. I think kind of for anyone new to kind of this kind of subject or exploring their own thoughts and views in the world. I think it puts it nicely in a nice kind of way. And I think like what you mentioned there, I when you were running them out, I could, as soon as you mentioned it, my brain was jumping, connecting dots for myself to that. And I think the thinking traps, they're very again at the moment I'm kind of in a changing, or we'll call it changing phase, where I'm starting to see a lot of stuff kind of with the subject matter I'm interviewing with guests and what I'm seeing in the world at large. I see a lot of connections. In a way, it would be right in saying, I'm not knocking the modern world. I mean, the modern world gave us a lot of gifts. It's gave us this technology that we can communicate. But in a way, especially in the West, do you think we're very much, the modern world's kind of amplifying these 8 thinking traps, that they're almost kind of, it's like an invisible cage that we kind of put ourselves around us, and we've got systems that are kind of in place, like the insurance industry. Again, I'm not knocking what works for them, but we've got a culture, especially here, is it's not my fault, it's your fault. I want money. So kind of like we're reinforcing these thinking traps to the point where we think, oh well, it isn't my fault. It is that person's fault. We even hear the famous story of the McDonald's coffee cup where they've had to put contents are hot, and apparently it was because somebody scalded themselves and they took McDonald's. I don't know how true that was, but apparently the urban myth was that they took McDonald's to the courts and they got a big payout. So it's do you feel like that's the case, that in our modern society we're unfortunately or inadvertently reinforcing these thinking traps?
Well, I think, you pointed out a few good examples of how we do that. I would say that I feel, in working with so many hundreds and maybe even thousands of people over the last 20 years, that I have realized that we share a common humanity. I mean, what you're going through, Jonathan, and what I'm going through, and what your neighbor's going through, and what the person in the other country is going through. I mean, we're all basically in it together, and many of us, at least in the Western world, have the certain kind of similar lens and perceive and understand and interpret things that happen to us in similar ways. And I find that actually maybe comforting on the one hand, because, it's not just me who's misperceiving things. It's the common way that we approach life. But at the same time, I find it a bit discouraging, because why didn't anyone tell us this? I mean, how did we go through all that schooling? How were we raised by, most of the time decent parents who were, not necessarily stupid themselves? How did we live lives and get to this point and not see any of this? It's almost baffling to me. And, in thinking about that, I realized because the people who taught us and the people who raised us didn't know this either. So it's like, wow, why haven't we all kind of gotten here sooner? And I guess it's an irrelevant question, because I guess as long as we get here now, then it's all good. And I think there is a big evolution of consciousness in the last number of years, and many people coming to similar awareness as this. I think the issue is, once we understand these things, and in my book Emotional Repatterning, I go through each of these thinking traps in detail, and I talk about them using my own patient stories. So I talk about the specifics and the details of patients who come to me with XYZ problem and how we kind of work through it. So I think it's approachable and it's fairly straightforward, and I think that reading the book, you can easily see yourself in every chapter. I guess the question becomes, what now? I mean, now that we understand, okay, yeah, the society we live in and the way we were raised kind of reinforce these misperceptions, and so we're all kind of guilty as charged. Now what? Like, how do we move on and address these things on a deep level so that we actually have a perception change?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think we're as a group on this planet, as a species. I do, even though you're kind of you kind of your brain's kind of weighing optimistic, pessimistic, but I think we are in a process of a positive change. I know I think change always, when it comes, it isn't a pleasant experience. It's always painful. So in a way, it's maybe what we're all going through at the moment is like one big gift for all of us, and we're just going to have to transition through it, and hopefully it'll be okay at the other side. Um, how you talk about acceptance? How important is acceptance in our lives, and how can we start to find it? And I think this is something, I suppose the world needs more of. We need to accept that there's some things that we can't change, or we need to be, I suppose, a bit more tolerant of each other.
Yeah. So, I just opened my book for a moment, and I have a nice little kind of introduction in that chapter of acceptance, which is the gap between how things are and how we think they should be is equal to the degree of our suffering. And I feel that that's really true. So if how things are and how I think they should be are pretty far apart, that's called my suffering. And when I'm honest with myself in that equation, I'm not going to change how things are. All I can change, my only leverage, is how I think they should be. And so if I can narrow that gap between how things are and how I think they should be, I will suffer less. And the more distant I am in terms of my acceptance of how things are, the more miserable I will be. And I have lived this in my life repeatedly, because I think I struggle personally with this one more than any other. Because it's easy to think he shouldn't have said that, and they shouldn't be that way, and that situation shouldn't have happened. And what I figured out is the more you argue with life, the more you'll realize you will never win. It's a battle that you will surely lose. So once we get that, we realize, okay, let me stop arguing with the way things are and the way people are and the way situations are, because this is a total waste of my energy. So could I align myself with how people are and how things are? Could I narrow the gap completely? And that is called acceptance. So once I accept that my boyfriend is like this, that my son is like this, that my employer is like this, acceptance doesn't mean I like it. Doesn't mean I agree with it. No, I can dislike something and accept it. And that's maybe where people get confused. What I have really tried to do in my life is accept people as they are and accept situations as they are. I may not like them at all. I may decide to change my life and move on, quit my job, change things. I can do that. Acceptance doesn't mean like, oh, well, this is how things are, and I might as well sit on the couch and eat chocolates and watch TV. No, that's not what acceptance is. It's to stop arguing with reality. This is how it is. Now what? Now what do I do? Right? Because we waste so much of our time arguing in our own heads about the fact that it shouldn't be that way, that we get stuck and we're miserable. So step one, how is it? Step two, I accept it. I accept it. I'm never going to change anyone. I'm never going to change anything. All I can do is change me. So now that I accept it, how do I want to change me? Because that suddenly empowers me to stop arguing with the way things are and either change myself to make things work better or potentially move on when they're not going to change, in which case now suddenly I'm not stuck anymore.
I think it's a very powerful concept, and it's something that recently in my own life I'm starting to employ. And I have to say, from it's a work in progress on my part.
For sure.
There's times that I think I talked to Tony about this. There's times that you walk away after employing that, and that wee voice in your head is kind of going, go back and say X, Y, and Z. And you go, no, that's not helpful. So I think it's. I think when you employ that, your things in life go a lot more smoothly, and it's not. If I'm watching it again, some people go, but is that not weakness? It's definitely not. I think it's actually stronger, because as you say, if you turn the other way, start fighting against it, it's horrendous. Just you're stressed. It just filters in, and it spills into other parts of your life. So it does as well.
Right. And I mean, we can ask ourselves, how successful have we ever been at changing anyone? I mean, I don't know about you, but in my life, I think I'm scoring a 0. So, I mean, at a certain point, we have to give up the bad habit because it's just not working for us, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, well, what's another way? I can keep hitting my head against the brick wall, but I'm going to get a bloody head. So, how then can I do it? I mean, I have to say, okay, this person is the way they are. They are never going to change. Wow, that's like a nickel dropping moment, right? You say, okay, then now what are my choices then? Which is a really different question than what I've been asking myself all along, right? Which is, how can I get them to see what I'm talking about and change?
Yeah, no, definitely.
So there's a lot of empowerment there. That's the piece. We get back our power when we decide to look at things differently.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think even with what's going on at the moment, I know a lot of people, and I've heard a lot about these people I know, but I've seen where, I know it's easier said than done, that they're not accepting of what's going on at the moment, and it's just eating them up, and it's messing with their mental health. It's horrendous to see, but there's nothing. It's not. I suppose it's saying that you have to go through it. I suppose that's life kind of beating you on the head with a stick until you learn a lesson. You're just like, so until it clicks. Going from that, obviously, for some people, it's a bit confusing. Loving ourselves, how important is that? And I know it might sound like narcissism or egotistical, but what is self-love, and how vital is that to your own overall well-being?
Well, for me, I think that this is in some ways the most important thing. I think it's a core belief, and it's always surprising to me when I work with patients how many people don't love themselves. And I mean, what's interesting about that is people in their conscious mind, right? We talked about the difference between conscious and subconscious beliefs. So people in their conscious mind, of course I love myself. I do all these things for myself, and I get a massage once a month, and I mean, of course I love myself. But the reality is, when we go deeper, which is what really my book is about, when we go deeper into the subconscious, we realize that people actually don't love themselves. Many people do not love themselves. And that could be evidenced by a lot of negative self-talk, a lot of, that background tape of negativity, criticism, and whatever. When you don't love yourself, wow, that leads to a lot of behaviors that can be really difficult, right? If I don't love myself, first of all, it's very hard to receive love from anyone, right? Because if that faucet is turned off, then how can I possibly accept love from somebody else if I don't even love myself? So right away, that makes for difficulties. If I don't love myself, it's also hard for me to love somebody else. And where I find this often shows up is people who have a real lack of boundaries with other people. So these are the super nice people who are always there to help and will do anything for you and go out of their way, and you can basically treat them badly and they're always coming back for more, and they're just these good people, and I put that in quotes, right? what is that really about, right? It's really about having no boundaries. And why do people have no boundaries when they don't love themselves? Because the emptiness inside and the ache inside from not loving yourself has to be filled somehow because it's so painful. So then we often look to that from the outside. We're so desperate to get that love, not realizing that we only need to give it to ourselves, not realizing that it's us who don't love ourselves. We're so desperate to get that love from the outside that we'll do anything to get it, right? We'll bend over backwards and do double flips in order to get someone to love us and be grateful and appreciate us and give us all those goodies. The sad thing is, first of all, often we don't get that back in any case, and we don't even get the appreciation for all we've done. So not only don't we get the love, but now we're bitter on top of it. But second of all, even if we did get the love back, even if we did get the appreciation back, we can't even take it in. We can't accept it. Because if I don't love myself, I can never believe that you love me because I don't love myself. So I can't accept your love. So, I mean, all to say, we're kind of screwed because we can't even take the love in that we might get back. And we just get bitter and resentful for all we've done. And then at the end of that, we not only don't feel better, we feel worse. So self-love is so critical. And, you know, one of the things in my book, I mean, the major kind of piece at the end is, you know, the book is entitled Emotional Repatterning for a reason. It's not just understanding all these thinking traps that lead to our misery. You know, the payoff at the end is that I teach the reader how to go into the subconscious mind and rewire the brain, learn something new, teach ourselves something new, not at the conscious level by affirmations or telling ourselves, you know, I love myself or whatever at the conscious level, but at the deep subconscious level, rewiring our thinking patterns and our beliefs there so that we can actually change these things. We can actually love ourselves. We can actually accept things on the outside. We can actually deeply know that we have infinite worth and value and that we are safe. And some of these really core things that many of us don't believe on a deep level, that we may not even know we don't believe on a deep level, and we can actually teach our brain something new and rewire some of these, let's call it wrong beliefs or negative thinking traps that we have kind of wired in from childhood often. And real change occurs when we can do that. I've seen it in my office working with people, actually phenomenal results. When we start to accept, love ourselves, believe in ourselves, and wire in all those good foundational beliefs, real change can happen. And I find that to be incredibly exciting.
Yeah, because it's regarding the self-love, but I think that's something that really hit me when I was preparing for this interview. I've seen it in a lot of people I know, and how it plays out. It's like and from my own experience, I love to talk about myself, but a long time ago, I went through a whole period of actually hating myself. I think pure hatred, and the way I can describe it, again, when you kind of come out of it or you kind of move beyond that, it's like you create you create your own hell on earth. And it's kind of like a vicious circle. It kind of like reinforces itself because you don't realize it's like basically being stuck in a horrible nightmarish roller coaster. You think it can't stop. You think you're a prisoner to it, but actually the stop button's in front of you. So yeah. So basically, when I was reading that, I'll not bore people with my own story, but when I was reading that there, it fairly hit home. And I kind of seen when you goes about some of the behaviours that comes from that, kind of like, yeah, that was kind of what I was doing. So yeah, it was a bit of a revelation. So it was.
Right.
Right.
And you know, often there's a lot of shame around these things, but I mean, the interesting piece is that this is really our shared common humanity. I mean, I don't think that there's anything you've gone through or have felt about yourself that I haven't also felt about myself. So that, I think, goes a long way to reducing any shame around some of these topics, because it's really, we're all in the same boat. So it's not a matter of shame. It's a matter of, okay, now what? Like recognizing this, realizing that I no longer am going to be happy with suffering. How do I upgrade the software in there, in my brain? How do I see life in a better way? How do I participate life in a way that works better, that changes my perception of things from my own more enjoyment of life, right? Because our time on this planet is limited, and we get to use it any way we want.
No, definitely, and I think I think it's just it's amazing at the time we're in. I mean, I say I was born in 1980, and I mean, what late 80s, 90s. I mean, as you say, getting access to this kind of thinking or this kind of material would have been very difficult. But now, as I said, people like yourself and some other amazing people, it's kind of through your own research, you're putting this in. And I think the thing I like about the book is there's action steps you can take. It's not just a theory drafted out. There's the book. What comes after that? But with this, you've got action steps, I think, which is great. So again, it's putting the responsibility back into the reader to kind of look within. In your own life, I know you had quite a stressful time. It was your son, I think, suffered from leukemia. Can you talk a bit more on that there, and what were some of the insights you gained from that experience?
Right. So when my son, who is my third child, my youngest, was 10, he was diagnosed with leukemia, and yeah, that was really a shock. His dad and I are both naturopathic doctors, and we raised our kids with, only the best, organic this, and, everything the best and the healthiest. And we were some of the more aware parents in that regard. So it was shocking that we could be dealt a hand of cards that was that devastating. All to say he lived and we made it, but it was 2 years of absolute hell. I mean, having never given my kids an antibiotic or an over-the-counter cough medicine, to have to go through 2 years of chemotherapy, and we're talking 154 chemo treatments in a 2-year period on a 10-year-old boy, was, beyond devastating. So the suffering that I went through, as you can imagine, was beyond, just ripped me open. And again, nobody wants to suffer, but you and I discussed earlier that often suffering is a really deep path to growth. And although I would never choose that for that boy and for us as a family, having gone through it, I can say that definitely things for me evolved, and I think I was kind of really ripped open, and I got much more in touch with my heart, and I got much more in touch with my intuition, my own sensitivity, which allowed me to approach patients in my practice on an even more deep and soulful level. And I think it allowed me to connect in a way that was really deeper. And I think actually the book and a lot of my insights evolved from that miserable period in my life, which really kind of opened me up to many other things. And so, nothing is all bad, I guess. There are good things that come out of badness or difficulties. And I think my additional insight and the book, definitely was an outgrowth of that time period.
Yeah. Again, it's like what you're saying. You're looking at those challenges as I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive to say this, as a gift as such.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't waking up every day during those years and saying, yippee, this is so fun. But what I did decide to do was accept reality. I guess the first few weeks I was arguing with reality. Well, how could this happen to us? And we did all these great things. And, you're fighting with reality. I quickly realized I wasn't changing reality with my dislike of it and my lack of acceptance. So I quickly got on board to kind of say, like, okay, this is happening. Now what? You know, how am I going to show up each day? What kind of story am I going to tell myself about this? How can I appreciate that this is a co-creation and a gift and not just bad luck? That, you know, we're all in this, my whole family, not just my son, but his brother and sister and all of us. We're in here for a reason. This is not a coincidence. This is not a bad luck. This is something that was given to us. What are we going to do with it, right? I mean, how are each of us going to show up for this? And how are we going to go through it? And how are we going to be changed by this? And how can we make the most of it? Which sounds like a ridiculous question, but it's the only positive question you can ask in that kind of a situation. And how are we going to show up with our best each and every day without that negative talk, why me, why us, and all the pessimism that is so easy to fall into? And how can I accept, in a sense, even death as a possible outcome of this, right? Without fearing death and without thinking that death is a horrible thing, without recognizing that death is going to happen to all of us. Of course, it doesn't feel good when it happens to a 10, 11, or 12-year boy, my own son, but that I had to recognize this is a potential outcome of this, and how can I be aware of that? And not in a pessimistic way or in a self-defeating way, but in an accepting way, that this story can have many different endings, and death is certainly one of them. And can I get myself okay with that possibility? Which wouldn't mean that it wouldn't be devastating and horrible, but that I didn't want to say, oh, don't talk about that. Don't mention that, you know, in a superstitious kind of way. It's like, no, this is a possible outcome. I have to be honest with myself to say, yeah, this could happen. How do I get myself okay with every outcome that can happen? And just realize that all I can do is show up every single day with my best for my son, with my best for myself, with my best with doctors, with my best with everything. How can I show up with that every day? And then the outcome's out of my hands. What more can I do? If I show up with my best every day, I've done my best. And whatever happens is going to happen. That's part of the co-creation piece of it, right? And so in some odd way, that was deeply comforting. I defined what was in my sphere of influence. I committed to doing my best with that. And I tried very hard to let go of the rest. And I think it was a good formula. I mean, I certainly had some devastating days and difficult periods, but I feel I went through it the best I could have. And I think it was something that helped me write the book, as I said, because I think I became more empowered from living it that way.
Yeah, and it's a very powerful lesson, and I think it's I suppose if you push something to the side or bury it deep in your mind and kind of go, we'll never visit that subject. And I remember when I was growing up, I think that was something that it was kind of a cultural thing, but there's certain topics you just never talked about. It was just buried. And then obviously inevitably those things happen because that was part of life. But by putting the blinkers on and refusing to maybe address that possibility, it kind of catches you off guard. It's very overwhelming. I know you can never prepare for bad things. You can never totally prepare, but even by not thinking about it or kind of meditating on that potential, I think it can overwhelm you, and almost like fight or flight. You can just freeze the spot and you have no way of dealing with it. But also, and I know we touched on this. I think it's really interesting. You have a chapter on responsibility. Can you elaborate on that and how important that is to ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we touched on it a bit earlier, but I think I try to approach my life, since I've understood this piece better, by always trying to look at what's my role in any dynamic. And I don't think most people do that. I know that in my younger life, I certainly didn't do that. It's all about how the other people were falling short or not living up to my expectations or wrong in their way of seeing things, and that didn't get me very far. I tried to take responsibility for my own my own piece in every story. What's the good of that? Well, first of all, it's the more honest way to go through it, I think. But second of all, as you said, the more responsible I am, the more I can change, right? If I have no responsibility in any of it, if it's up to everybody else and it's not my fault and it's everybody else's fault, I'm truly stuck with everything that exists the way it is because I have just given away all my power. If I recognize my own responsibility as much as I can in every dynamic, well, I can change then. I can change. I can alter. I can change everything that's mine. So I think it's almost a selfish way of doing it. It sounds like a blaming way, but it's not. It's very selfish. The more of it I can take on, the more of it I can change. So that suits me very well.
Yeah. And I think it's also, you see it in health ways where instead of a lot of policies, I know people mean well and the intention behind it is good, but you see a lot of policy like we have a sugar tax here in the UK, and again you see people talking about suing fast food companies and kind of putting the blame onto them for their bad health, but really as the old saying goes, the buck stops here, it stops with yourself, and definitely I think it's something. So that's why I've kind of U-turn to come back to this. I think it's something often it's not touched on much, or the emphasis is not put on the people. It's kind of like people turn to the government or their elected officials and go, this is a problem here. That's not our fault. Can you pass the buck on to the villain?
Right. Well, it's interesting because an enormous percentage of people are on antidepressants and anti-anxiety pills. When I first started researching for the book, I came upon some numbers that were truly shocking. And that's, probably more in the Western world. Maybe I don't know about, in other parts of the world. But when you recognize how many people are depressed and anxious, enough to the point where they feel that they need to go on prescription medications indefinitely, you realize that something's not right. I mean, something's wrong. We've taken the wrong turn somewhere. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I do believe that some of the answers lie in what we've been discussing today. When I don't take responsibility for myself and I abdicate responsibility to everyone else, well, I find that depressing and I find that anxiety producing, because then I have no empowerment over my own well-being, my own future, how I manage what's going to happen to me. I'm completely a victim, and I think that is depressing, and that would be anxiety producing, right? So how do we deeply understand that we love ourselves, that we are safe, that we have infinite worth and value, that we are connected, that we are not here alone, that we are enough? It's endless, all the things that if we did deeply believe those things about ourselves, how different would we show up in the world? I have to believe very different. And in the patients I've worked with, using similar techniques that I described in the book, Emotional Repatterning, I think people have reported back to me a phenomenal level of change and success in their lives. I mean, I think that the shifts in perception on a deep level are profound. And people feel like it's almost effortless once you change things deeply and not just in your, conscious chattering mind. Once you deeply change your perceptions, well, you show up effortlessly in a much better way because you're not being held back by those beliefs, those underlying beliefs which don't serve you.
Yeah, no, definitely. I know I've got quite a lot of material to talk about. I know we're pushed for time to a certain extent. If before we obviously move on to different subject matter, one of the questions I have is how can we turn our suffering as a strength, and not just as a weakness? I suppose it's fallen that kind of victim mindset. How can we kind of what kind of advice would you give, or tips would you give somebody who's maybe went through hardships or whatever, and they kind of fall in that kind of victim mindset? How I know it's only quite a deep question, where the answer would be quite deep. How would you, what steps or advice would you give for them to kind of turn that wine into making that more of a strength?
Right. So, deep suffering has the ability to really break us open, because suffering is so difficult that the crying and the sadness, the anxiety, whatever it is that you're going through, is so deep that it's a moment in time where we're really able to make changes in a way that probably we don't do when things are going well. So it is an opportunity, even though, nobody in their right mind would choose that. we do often find ourselves confronting difficulty. And I think in that moment, we have the ability to look deep in ourselves and find out where we want to evolve. And it is difficult to do alone because we are often stuck in our own patterns. What I really like about what I presented in my book, Emotional Repatterning, is the ability to actually rewire your deep beliefs. There's a technique in there that I describe, which allows us to deeply learn a new way of believing and approaching life, believing in ourselves and approaching life. And when we are able to rewire our deep subconscious beliefs and upgrade them for the better, we find that the suffering diminishes and our wisdom increases. And it's a lot easier to go through difficulty when we have a different perspective, right? Viktor Frankl being a great example, as we discussed earlier. So there is hope, there is a way out, there is a method to the madness, as they say. It's hard when we're just stuck with our conscious thoughts. For sure, we're not going to get very far if we're just working on that level. The invitation is to really explore what lies deeply and to try to do an upgrade at that level. So I would hope that if what we've discussed today interests your listeners, they might be interested in my book, because there's a lot of the book devoted to kind of these thinking traps that we're in and how we get stuck in suffering. But there is a way to get out of that, and it works. And I don't know, I think it would be really interesting to get the feedback from people who try it. And certainly my patients, when I work with them on this level, have found it very profound.
Yeah, no, definitely. And again, I am watching this. I definitely recommend purchasing the book. I think what's powerful about it is I said, I've already mentioned this, there's a lot of take action points. And at the end of the day, I think if you're learning anything, or studying anything, or learning a new skill, it's really not about accumulating knowledge, it's about putting stuff into practice, see what works for them. So I definitely recommend it. And one of the things I will be bringing to this channel will be a book review, and this will be a book that'll be definitely on that list. Lisa, so moving on, obviously, as I mentioned at the start, you start working for Procter and Gamble, and at the moment the buzzword going around is pretty much pivoting. You hear about businesses saying they're pivoting due to COVID and stuff like that. What made you pivot, obviously, your career, obviously from what people would say was a very secure job, probably loads of corporate benefits and corporate security attached to that. What made you decide this isn't for you and you wanted to change? Because I know you went back to college to re-educate, and what were some of the hurdles that you experienced along the way? Can you hear me okay, Lisa?
Yeah, I'm just going to move a little closer to my internet so we can try to make that a bit better. So I mean, it's true. I worked at Procter & Gamble for 10 years, and well, there were great parts of the job, for sure, the money being maybe the biggest one. But I couldn't deny how unhappy I was. I mean, I felt it was like a soul-killing experience. Not because anybody was particularly mean, but it was just didn't speak to my deeper self, let's say. I felt that the products that I was marketing and what I was responsible for were rather meaningless things and weren't going to improve humanity at all, like a different fragrance of shampoo, or, you know, it wasn't going to make any difference to anybody. And I wanted, I guess, to have more of an impact and feel better about how I was spending my life. So yeah, a series of events happened, and there was an opportunity, and I grabbed it, which was to basically leave and go back to naturopathic medical school, which I had dreamed of doing for years, but, you know, didn't want to give up the money. But I just realized at a certain point it was something I had to do. So I went back, and I went back to a 4-year naturopathic medical school. I became a naturopathic physician and have had the absolute pleasure of working with patients over the last 22 years in my clinic in Montreal, and working with them on a number of levels using different therapies, but really on a holistic perspective always, you know, mind, body, physically, mentally, and emotionally, to help them overcome obstacles in their health. And, you know, in the last few years, more and more, I've been working with people, dealing with them on the emotional level, along the lines of all that I've shared in my book. So realizing where we get stuck and how that causes us to suffer, and how we can deeply change our beliefs and approach life in a better way.
Yeah, and when you made that decision, did you get a lot of support from people around you, or was it people kind of skeptically kind of going, "Are you sure? Or is this the right thing to do?"
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I was fairly well supported. I think mostly because the close people in my life knew how miserable I had been for so many years, and just kind of biding time, and, you know, just not really having the courage to do the right thing for myself. And I think, you know, when people love you, we would hope that they want the best for you, and making money and having material things is often not the best for us, especially if that makes us unhappy. I mean, if we're doing things we love and we make lots of money, that's great. But if we're miserable inside, the paycheck doesn't necessarily, you know, offset that. So I felt that I was supported by the people in my life, I think, to make that change. But it was a real change of life. I went back to school and, you know, living as a student and in learning mode rather than in, you know, authority mode, or having all those responsibilities. And yeah, I mean, it was a whole life change at that point, and I think it's done me well.
Yeah, because I think that's the danger we fall into, and I know people, including myself, you can fall into a job, and all you're there is just it's just running the meter up. You're just there to get the time in and collect the paycheck, and whatever happens after that in the job, you're not interested. And I think it's I know sometimes necessity means we have to take a job like that, but I think it's important to try and, at least as much as you can, find a job or a role that you get some kind of satisfaction back. And I think that's maybe what's missing today in a lot of jobs. A lot of people kind of, I think there was some survey done, and I forget what the percentage rate was, but quite a large percentage of people said they weren't happy in their jobs, and it was just, they're just there to pay bills, and that's it. So I think it's important to go for that, to go for your what you would like to do.
Yeah.
Last question, Lisa. And this is a new question I've kind of brought in. So you're the third interview I've kind of brought this in. What's your mission statement? This kind of comes from we meet up a lot of people sitting with goals stuff, and they often say have a mission statement. So what would yours be?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you.
All right.
I think my mission statement would be to help people, and that includes my close family members, my best friends, my patients, and, you know, everyone I feel that I'm close to try to see things in a more clear way. I think the distortions, and we've gone through them, you know, at length, keep us in a mode of suffering and unhappiness. And certainly, speaking for myself, that has been true. I feel like I have gained some deep insight, whether that's through the suffering of my son and the ordeal we lived through, or that's just for the gift of being able to be there for patients in an intimate setting and have them reveal deep things to me about themselves, we get an insight about humanity when we speak to many people on a deep level. I feel that I gained a certain amount of wisdom from all of that. And if I could give that back in a way to anyone who's open to that, either in my work in my office or through my book, I think that would be an amazing mission, because I do think that as a collective, we don't live very well in terms of our perspective. You know, we may have the latest iPhone and we may have all these gadgets around us, but I think as a species, as a group, as humanity, we don't live very well in our mind. And, you know, there is a way out. There is an upgrade to that. And so if I have a few bits of understanding about that, I think my mission would be to share that with people who are receptive to that idea and help them upgrade how they approach life to reduce their suffering. I think that that would be, well, an amazing mission statement.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's something that resonates with myself and kind of how I feel like things are going. I think we're capable of so much more. And unfortunately, the sad thing is that we don't. A lot of us don't kind of reach our potential. Sadly. So Lisa, how if people want to get in touch with you, I'll purchase the book, or even or get some help from yourself, because I know you have an online consultation available.
Yes, right. I do online consultations. My website is lisasamet.com, lisasamet.com. And you can find all the information about me there. The book is coming out. It ships in 2 weeks. It's called Emotional Repatterning, and by me. And I hope that your listeners have appreciated what we've said, and maybe it's relevant to them. And if they want to look into it more, I think they'll enjoy the book.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I know I've said this a couple of times. Definitely recommend the book if you're interested in figuring out what your mindset is and how it affects your life. And I know from my own experience, it's a bit like a jigsaw, and it's kind of like there's the lid off the box. It helps kind of put things together. So it is definitely highly recommended. Are you planning another book just before we finish, or is there any more?
That's funny. I mean, I have some ideas, but I'm not sure yet. I feel like, you know, I'm open to the idea for sure. Let's see what life brings.
No worries. Well, thank you, Lisa. And I really appreciate your time. It was really great. Again, apologies for the technical difficulties.
No problem at all. It was great being here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.